The letter arrived on a rainy afternoon, the kind of day that seemed to press the world into a muted haze. Rosa had been sitting by the window, knitting with a steady rhythm as the rain streaked down the glass, blurring the view of her small garden. The sound of the mail slot clattering broke her concentration, followed by the soft thud of a letter landing on the worn floor. First, she didn't move. Over the years, letters had become rare, her bills were delivered electronically, and the last personal note she'd received was a holiday card from a distant cousin 2 years ago. But something about this letter felt different, a strange weight that drew her out of her chair and toward the door. The envelope was old, its edges yellowed and slightly frayed. The ink on the front faded but legible. Rosa Alvarez. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her breath catching as she unfolded the paper inside. The handwriting was familiar, achingly so. It was her son's, Miguel's. His bold, looping letters unmistakable even after all these years. She sank back into her chair, her heart pounding as she began to read. "Dear Mama, if this letter ever reaches you, it means I found a way to send it after all. The trenches are no place for anyone, let alone for the men who've spent weeks here, waiting for something to change. We wait for news, for orders, for the war to give us a reason to keep going. But mostly we wait for home. Mama, I think of you every day. I remember the way your hands smelled of lavender when you would braid my hair as a boy, and how you'd hum that tune, the one you said your mama sang to you. I think about the way the sunlight fell on our kitchen table in the mornings, how it turned everything gold. There are boys here who don't have those memories. Boys who never had mothers like you to tell them they were loved. I share your stories with them sometimes. I tell them about your garden and the way you said every tree carries the whispers of those who planted it. It gives them something to hold on to, something to imagine when the night gets too long. I don't know if I'll make it home, Mama, but if I don't, know that you are my last thought, my greatest comfort. You are my hope always." The letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged as if he had been interrupted while writing. Rosa's hands fell to her lap, the letter trembling in her grasp. Tears blurred her vision as the words echoed in her mind. It had been over 20 years since Miguel disappeared. The official notice had come months after he stopped writing. A cold statement that offered no explanation, no closure. "Missing in action," they'd said, as if those words could encapsulate the loss of her only son. But now, here it was, his voice, his love, returned to her after all these years. Her eyes lingered on a line near the bottom of the letter. "I tell them about your garden and the way you said every tree carries the whispers of those who planted it." A spark ignited in her chest, fragile but persistent. Miguel had written this letter in a town far from here, a place she'd never visited but now felt inexplicably drawn to. She made her decision before she even realized it. Rosa rose from her chair, her knees protesting the sudden movement. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope, and began gathering her things. She was going to find that town. The journey was long and unfamiliar. Rosa hadn't traveled much in her life, and the train stations and bus terminals were disorienting, their crowds and announcements overwhelming. But she clutched Miguel's letter tightly, its weight anchoring her. She arrived in the town just before sunset, the warm light casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. It was smaller than she'd imagined, the kind of place where everyone likely knew each other. Rosa's gaze swept over the modest houses and the church steeple rising in the distance. Somewhere here, Miguel had written his final words to her. She wandered through the town, clutching the letter like a talisman. She asked questions hesitantly at first, unsure of what she hoped to find. Most people shook their heads, apologizing that they didn't know anything about the soldiers who had passed through so many years ago. But then, as she approached the edge of the town, She found a woman tending to a small garden outside her house. The woman looked up as Rosa approached, her hands dusted with soil, her face kind but curious. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm. Rosa hesitated, then held out the letter. "My son wrote this from somewhere near here," she said, her voice trembling. "His name was Miguel. He was a soldier." The woman's expression softened, and she stepped closer, her eyes scanning the letter before meeting Rosa's gaze. "I remember hearing about a group of soldiers," she said slowly. "They camped near the fields just outside of town. My father used to say he brought them water." "Can you take me there?" Rosa asked, her voice urgent. The woman hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Of course. Come with me." The field was vast, stretching to the horizon, its golden grasses swaying gently in the breeze. Rosa stood at its edge, the woman beside her, as the late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in light. "This is where they were," the woman said softly. "I'm sorry I don't know more." Rosa nodded, her eyes scanning the field. She could almost imagine Miguel here, sitting among his comrades, writing his letter under the same sun. The woman touched Rosa's arm gently. "There's something I should show you," she said. They walked a little further to a grove of trees. Rosa stopped, her breath catching as she took in the sight. Each tree had a small plaque at its base, bearing the name of a soldier who had fought and fallen. "We started planting them a few years ago," the woman explained. "Families who came looking for answers. They planted these trees in honor of their loved ones, to give them a place to rest." Rosa knelt by one of the plaques, her fingers brushing over the engraved name. The tree above it swayed gently, its leaves rustling like a quiet whisper. She looked up at the woman, her voice steady. "I'd like to plant one for Miguel." The woman smiled, her eyes glistening. "Of course." And in that moment, Rosa felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of purpose, of connection. Miguel's words had led her here, to this field, to this grove, to this beginning. The next morning, Rosa found herself standing at the edge of the grove, the early light casting long shadows across the trees. The woman from the day before, whose name she now knew was Elena, arrived carrying a small sapling cradled in her arms. It was a young olive tree, its slender branches swaying gently in the breeze. "This one is yours," Elena said softly, handing it to Rosa. Rosa held the sapling carefully, her fingers brushing over its fragile leaves. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena smiled and gestured toward a patch of open ground at the edge of the grove. "We'll plant it here, where it can grow strong and have room to breathe." Rosa nodded, and together they began digging the hole. The earth was dry but soft, yielding easily to the small spade Elena had brought. As they worked, Rosa couldn't help but think of her son's hands, how they had once helped her plant their family's first lemon tree back home. Miguel had been only 10 at the time, his face bright with excitement as he packed the soil around the roots. "Mama, do you think it'll grow big enough to touch the sky?" he'd asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "I think it'll grow as big as it's loved," she'd replied, ruffling his hair. Now, years later, she was planting another tree for him. This time, it wasn't just for shade or fruit. It was for memory, for love, for the whispers Miguel had written about in his final letter. When the hole was ready, Rosa knelt beside it, lowering the sapling into the ground. Elena handed her a watering can, and Rosa poured the cool water over the roots, watching as the earth soaked it up greedily. Elena placed a small plaque at the base of the tree, its metal surface gleaming in the sunlight. "Do you want to add his name now?" she asked gently. Rosa nodded, her hands trembling as she traced Miguel's name onto the plaque with a small engraving tool. Each letter felt like a quiet prayer. Miguel Alvarez. When she finished, she sat back, gazing at the tree as it swayed gently in the breeze. A lump rose in her throat, but she forced herself to smile. "Do you think he'd like it?" Elena rested a hand on Rosa's shoulder, her voice steady. "I think he'd love it, and I think he'd be proud of you for planting it." Over the next few days, Rosa stayed in the small town, visiting the grove each morning. Word of her arrival spread quickly, and soon other families began coming to see her, drawn by the story of Miguel's letter. One of the first was a man named Eduardo, his face weathered but kind. He carried a photograph of his younger brother, who had also been lost in the war. "I didn't know we could plant trees for them," Eduardo said, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you think I could do the same?" Rosa smiled, her heart swelling with quiet purpose. Of course, every tree carries a story. Others followed, a mother clutching a faded scarf that had belonged to her son, a young woman carrying a locket with her father's picture inside, a boy who had never met his uncle but wanted to honor him all the same. Each brought their own sapling, and together, they planted them in the grove. The air buzzed with quiet conversations, hands working together to dig holes, water roots, and place plaques. The grove began to transform, its once sparse landscape filling with life and whispers of memory. As Rosa watched the trees sway in the wind, she felt a strange kind of peace settle over her. The pain of losing Miguel would never truly leave her. But here, surrounded by others who had loved and lost, the burden felt lighter. One afternoon, Eduardo approached Rosa as she sat beneath her son's tree, the shade cool against the heat of the day. He held a small notebook in his hands, its leather cover worn and cracked. "I thought you might like this," he said, handing it to her. "It's something I found while cleaning out my brother's things." Rosa opened the notebook carefully, her breath catching as she read the first few lines. It was a journal filled with entries written from the trenches. Eduardo's brother had described the same struggles Miguel had. Long nights, constant fear, and the ache of missing home. But there were also moments of beauty. The way the stars seemed brighter in the desert, the rare laughter shared between comrades, the hope that someday the war would end. "Thank you," Rosa said softly, her voice trembling. Eduardo smiled faintly, his gaze drifting toward the grove. "I think they'd like knowing we're doing this, that we're remembering them." Rosa nodded, clutching the notebook tightly. "I think so too." The grove became a gathering place over the following weeks. Families visited regularly, tending to the trees, sharing stories, and finding comfort in each other's presence. The once barren patch of land now hummed with life, its trees standing tall against the vast expanse of the desert. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Rosa stood beneath Miguel's tree. The breeze rustled its leaves, their soft whispers carrying a sense of quiet hope. She touched the plaque at its base, tracing her son's name with her fingers. "I hope you can see this, Miguel," she murmured. "I hope you know that your words brought us here, that they've given so many a reason to keep going." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the growing grove, and Rosa smiled. For the first time in years, the ache in her chest felt less like a wound and more like a thread connecting her to something greater. Miguel's letter had never reached her in time to save him, but it had found her when she needed it most, and in its wake, it had brought her here, to a place of love, memory, and quiet beginnings. The grove whispered around her, its leaves rustling like a song carried on the wind. And Rosa knew that Miguel's hope, his love, would continue to grow, rooted in the trees they had planted together.